So everyone will have seen this particular painting, and you may or may not know what it's about. I was listening to a broadcast last night, I think, and it's about Cubism, Picasso, and the Cubists never wanted to discuss what their work was about. And I, unfortunately, haven't really been following Cubist rules, because I'm always talking about what my work is about, and I guess I'm not a Cubist, am I? You could probably see that. Okay, so this work is Toussaint Louverture at Bederet. It's created in 2004, and essentially it is a very large and beautiful oil painting. It's quite straightforward in its aboutness. It is about the Battle of Bederet, which took place in Haiti, the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean in 1802. And it was a battle that took place between emancipated slaves, primarily of African descent, and the army of Napoleon Bonaparte. And Remy is who's curated the show in the Usher Gallery, has very cleverly arranged the Usher Gallery so that as you walk into the first room, there's a bust of Napoleon, and then you see this painting sort of toward there on the left in the ground floor sort of room. And so for me, that's a very beautiful irony, because obviously the painting reflects this conflict which took place in the Caribbean between the emancipated slaves and the army of Napoleon Bonaparte. And there's a quotation at the bottom, which is from a book by the Caribbean or the Trinidadian historian who spent most of half his life in Britain, C.L.R. James, who in his book, The Black Jacobins, gave a very brief description, and it's from that description which sort of gave me the sort of idea of how to name and describe this particular battle. And C.L.R. James says that Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the African emancipated slaves in Haiti, launched the first attack on the Fort Bederet, which was controlled by the French, as usual, leading the charge with sword drawn. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure everyone does, but just in case, I've given us a little map of the Caribbean. See South America there, with Florida at the top. So we know we're in the Western Atlantic. Hispaniola is that sort of big island in the middle, and Haiti, I've colored in the flags of the Haitian Revolution, and you will see that I am actually wearing the flags of the Haitian Revolution myself today, but slightly reversed, red and blue. And Haiti became an independent state. It was the second state to become independent in the Americas in the colonial era after the United States in 1804. And this took place after a very long and bloody war between the 500,000 Africans who had been enslaved on the island and their French, British, Spanish sort of colonial powers, which were struggling to keep them in slavery. And the sort of revolution which these slaves launched achieved its final victory in 1804. And so the painting which I made, or the series of paintings, this is one of a series of 5, were made to celebrate the bicentenary of that event, that sort of a momentous achievement in human history in 2004. And so what you see here is a scan of the sort of private view invitation, which also happened to be my first solo show, which took place in Brixton, in the heart of the Caribbean community in London, as I'm sure everyone does know. And so in that sense, the works have a kind of very specific time and place sort of element to them, in that it was important to me that the work be shown in the Caribbean sort of settlement in London, because it pertained to the history of the Caribbean, and also that the date was very significant, being a significant, bicentenary of this Haitian Revolution. And the meaning of the Haitian Revolution for myself is very important because, Remy's talked about race, and obviously we know that the history of the Caribbean, race and slavery are very intimately tied up. And this event, which took place in 1804, the independence of Haiti from the French Empire, was the first kind of significant defeat of colonialism and racial slavery in the New World. And indeed the first time in history that slaves themselves had actually overthrown permanently their masters and established themselves as a sort of independent state. So although it's a little known event, the Haitian Revolution in British kind of culture, it is in world culture a very significant event. Toussaint Louverture, who's the man depicted in my painting at the center of the sort of charge and in the title, is a figure who is very well known in the Caribbean and appears in a great a deal of visual arts, particularly in Haiti, but also around the world. And I've given you three sort of examples of Toussaint's art related to Toussaint Louverture. One by the sort of great American painter and printmaker Jacob Lawrence, who in 1938 produced a sort of long series of works about the life of Toussaint Louverture. And then this is by Edward Jean, who's sort of working in the popular kind of vernacular style of Haitian painting, which you could have seen. Did anyone visit the show at the Nottingham Contemporary last year about Haitian arts? They had a sort of whole exhibition of Haitian art at that show. And then finally, we've seen just quite recently in the last year a sort of television production, sort of quite a big budget production by Philippe Niang, which is a French sort of production showing the life and achievements of Toussaint Louverture in his struggle. And you can see that they've copied the uniform from my painting. Oh, that's a joke. Very. But I should actually say, just to say that although there is a kind of a facile way which you could look at this kind of painting and think, well, yeah, he just sort of, did it. But actually, making a painting of this nature does require a great deal of research into uniforms, how the horses are dressed, what kind of costumes or clothes people wore or would have worn at the time, the kind of rifles that would have been used. So actually quite an extensive period of sort of really trawling through libraries and ancient documents, trying to sort of give this painting its reality. And the next image kind of shows partly why, because I wanted to use a process which is known, or sometimes is referred to as détournement by the French philosopher Debord, in which you might take elements from a particular work of art, an existing work of art, and transform them to give them a kind of opposite meaning. And you can see from this painting what I'm talking about a little bit. This is a painting created in 1800. It's one of 5 editions made by Jacques-Louis David, the neoclassical master painter. And you can see the title, Bonaparte Crossing the Alps, or sometimes known as Napoleon Crossing the Alps. And certain things, it's a very dramatic, sort of very finely and beautifully painted thing. And in his different editions, Jacques-Louis David has made various sort of changes. So there's an edition where Napoleon has a red cloak instead of a golden one. And currently the original painting is on display at the Musée National du Château de Malmaison. So Napoleon there can be seen in all his glory to this day, charging up the Alps, leading his grand army to invade Italy. And then if you compare the two paintings, mine and David, you can see that I've been quite specific in trying to sort of, if you like, make a clear commentary between the two. Just even the proportions, sort of between where the head of the horse is and the feet of the horse, you can see they kind of fairly similarly line up the way, the gesture of holding the rearing horse, the angle of the land sort of sloping up. Haiti is a very mountainous country as well. So there's a sort of a detournement thing going there in which you're taking the meanings inherent in one work and sort of transforming them. And if I give you a particular instance of that transformation, you shall see, for example, that in David's version of a military leader taking his troops to war, you can see that the leader, Napoleon, completely dominates the picture, whereas his troops are so minuscule in the background, the people who actually did the fighting, that is, that you would, at first glance, barely even notice they're there, because they're sort of almost hidden behind a sort of an outcrop of rock. Whereas in my own painting, I have tried to stick to the revolutionary spirit of the Haitian people, in which the ordinary people, the slaves, the people who did the work in the fields and sort of manned the factories of the sugar plantations, were actually the people who carried, as it were, the leader, Toussaint, into these victories over Napoleon's army in the end. As an English person, it's quite, I feel, I'm not sure, this talked about ambiguity, Remy. Bonaparte. So obviously England fought against Bonaparte and eventually captured and imprisoned him. He's still, as I said, sort of raised given us this sort of glorified status in France through particularly the work of artists like David. After the black people of Haiti had freed themselves from slavery, Napoleon, basically, he launched an invasion of Haiti, or the island, and this was his command that he gave to his general. The political goal should be to disarm the blacks, put them back into slavery. So after people had freed themselves from slavery in Haiti, Napoleon, when he came to power, tried to put them back into slavery, and this was where the war came through, which we see depicted in my painting. And his Napoleon's son-in-law, brother-in-law, who was the general he sent to the Caribbean, sort of wrote this about his policy of how he was going to achieve the political goal of disarming the blacks and put them into slavery. We must destroy all the mountain Negroes, men and women, sparing only children under 12 years of age. We must destroy half the Negroes of the plains. I shall have to wage a war of extermination. And this was what General Leclerc wrote in 1802. And so this other painting, which we see in the Usher Gallery upstairs, is, if you like, a kind of just a sort of an embodiment of Leclerc and Napoleon's policy. This was what they were attempting to do. What does it look like if you attack a country and determine you're going to exterminate everybody over the age of 12? And I suppose, in a sense, perhaps I don't need to say much more about what this painting is about. It's called Bacchus and Ariadne, which I suppose is an ironic reference to a Greek legend, which also involves captivity and people being stranded on islands. So there are the two paintings side by side, and I don't know whether I've come to 15 minutes or beyond 15 minutes or whatever, but I'm going to stop there. So thank you very much for listening. Appreciate that.